This afternoon we're going to have two talks on is the universe designed. There's a pair of talks. The first one will be an atheist view and the second one will be a theist view. So we'll perhaps get different perspectives. The idea of this weekend course on science, religion and atheism is not to bash each other about the head about whether you believe in God or not, but to see whether the perspective you're coming from, either atheist or agnostic or theist, changes the narrative when you look at particular topics. So that's what our aim is, and we've been doing really well so far, so we look forward to that. So let me just tell you just a couple of things about Stephen Law, who's the first of these two talks. He's a senior lecturer in philosophy at Atheist College in London. He did his undergraduate and PhD work in Oxford. He's currently working on topics such as the philosophy of religion. And there's a few of his books downstairs, I think that's right, isn't there, on the book table if you want to pursue any of the topics further. The team may happy with this, but so without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Right. So the question is the universe designed? And I'm here to give you an atheist view, apparently. So that's what I'm going to do. Oh dear. Is this going to work? So, so I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any gods at all. The God I'm going to focus on today is the God of traditional monotheism, if you like, a God that is supposed to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. The three O's God, if you like. That's the God I'm going to focus on. I consider belief in such a God to be pretty unreasonable as an atheist. Clearly, there's going to be some disagreement in the room about just how reasonable a belief this is, and that's really what we're here to explore, particularly with regard to empirical evidence, observation of the world around us. How reasonable a belief is it to believe in a God like this, given what we can see around us, the character of the universe that we inhabit. It seems to me, just to clarify to begin with, it's a fairly obvious but important point. It seems to me that reasonableness is a matter of degree. Beliefs can be more or less reasonable. We might order our beliefs on a scale, perhaps a vertical scale of reasonableness. And towards the top of my scale, I would place Japan exists. I've never been there. I've never seen the place with my own eyes, but it seems to me an eminently reasonable belief for me to hold, given that there's, lots of evidence that Japan does exist, such as various things marked made in Japan, like people who came to Japan and so on. There's a big island in the top left-hand corner of the Pacific Ocean, according to my maps and so on. So I have every reason to believe that Japan is a real place, despite the fact I've never seen it. There is, of course, a possibility of error, even there. It's always possible that there is some vast Western conspiracy to dupe people into thinking that Japan is a real place when it is not. I don't know if you saw about this programme a few years ago, Channel 4 programme, I think it was, called Space Cadets, where they took some admittedly fairly gullible people and told them that they were going to go into space. And so they took them to this Russian space base, and they trained them, people with cold Russian accents trained them, and they kitted the place out with Russian stuff. It was actually a big barn in Lowestoft. And after the training, they were then introduced to the spaceship. There was lots of dry ice, and it was actually a flight simulator. And then finally, they get to take a spacewalk, and of course, the spacewalk involves putting on a suit, opening the hatch, and stepping out in front of a studio audience, who are all laughing at you. Now, that was an extraordinarily elaborate conspiracy to dupe these young people into thinking that they were in space, when in fact they were not. And I suppose there could be some elaborate conspiracy to dupe Westerners into thinking that Japan exists when it does not. Why on earth would they do that? I don't know. It's a possibility. Okay? The mere fact that a belief is eminently reasonable does not mean that there is not, nevertheless, the possibility of doubt, the possibility there. And then as we come down the scale of reasonableness, we find beliefs such as electrons exist. Again, seems to me a very reasonable belief for us to hold. Perhaps that's moved up the scale of reasonableness in response to the evidence that has become available to us. Halfway up the scale, maybe an extraterrestrial intelligence exists. Not an unreasonable thing to believe, it seems to me, given that we know life has evolved on this planet, and we know that there are literally billions of planets like this one out there. But on the other hand, we don't have any direct evidence of such intelligence, at least not yet. So perhaps it's about halfway up the scale of reasonableness. Not an unreasonable thing to believe, but perhaps reasonable doubts can be entertained about it. And then at the bottom we have fairies exist, goblins exist, Santa exists, obviously downright unreasonable beliefs. And then the question, no, we've all agreed about those beliefs, I take it, and where they are on the scale. And then we hit the bottom one on my list, God exists. And now suddenly we're all over the scale, aren't we? We disagree significantly about how reasonable a belief this one is. And I want to put it quite low on the scale, and I suspect many of you would want to put it at least halfway up the scale. In some cases, quite a lot higher than that, even. So it's interesting that there is this range of opinion about how reasonable the belief is. And assuming that we have access to the same evidence and the same experiences, perhaps we don't. It might be a bigger question, actually. But if we do, then clearly some of us are mistaken about just how reasonable it is. So who is it then? Who's mistaken? Right. Well, so really I'm going to look at the question of why do people in particular disagree about the extent to which empirical observation supports or undermines this particular God hypothesis. According to some people, observation of the world suggests, even strongly suggests to them that God exists. Almost obvious, with anyone with eyes to see that there is a God, it seems to them. Whereas other people look at the world and they think that what they see around them pretty much straightforwardly, empirically falsifies the claim that God exists. And yet they're looking at the same world. How can that be? Well, as I said, we can't both be right. We're here specifically to consider evidence of design and what you might call theism and atheism with a capital T and a capital I. So I'm talking about the traditional God of monotheism, the 3O God here. You're a theist with a capital T if you believe in that God. You're an atheist with a capital I if you reject belief in that God, if you say there's no such God. I want to look at the claim of many theists that there is evidence for design, which is in turn evidence for theism with a capital T, and also how the same theists with a capital T often then respond to empirical evidence against theism. That should be at the capital T at the end there, but it doesn't, because I wrote this in haste yesterday evening, sorry. So that last theism should have a capital T. To me, the approach of many theists with a capital T to the evidence as a whole looks odd, looks dubious, and I'm going to try and convey why, and we can perhaps talk about whether my concerns are valid concerns. Evidence that does not particularly support theism with a capital T is often presented as if it does. Powerful evidence against theism with a capital T is often ignored or else just explained away by one reason or another. And this pattern of responses, it seems to me, is characteristic actually of many irrational belief systems, such as, for example, young Earth creationism, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this session. So that's my concern. So I'm really just going to raise some worries along these lines, but I don't pretend that I have a knockdown conclusive argument or anything like that. So let's look at evidence for theism with a capital T. According to many scientists, the universe has a fine-tuned character to it. It appears to have been fine-tuned for life. Had the cosmological constants been just very slightly different, life and intelligence would never have emerged. And then I thought that observation is followed up by the question, what are the chances? What are the chances that the universe would have this Goldilocks property of being just right for life, just right to produce intelligent beings? Very low, actually. Chances are very, very low. If this was merely a matter of the levers of the universe having been set by chance. But what if somebody set them that way deliberately? Some intelligence deliberately chose those values? Well, that would actually explain the fine-tuned character of the universe. And in fact, that is a much better, a far more reasonable conclusion to draw, according to some. And indeed, this then constitutes some evidence, perhaps quite good evidence, that there is a God with a capital G. So, for example, here is Martin Rees talking about fine-tuning. He says, there's a degree of fine-tuning in the expansion speed, the material content of the universe, and the strengths of the basic forces seems to have been prerequisite for the emergence of the hospitable cosmic habitat in which we live. Many scientists would agree about that. The argument is not so new. You can find versions of it back in the 1920s. So here is F.R. Tennant. He says, for the point is that for the existence of any forms of life that we may conceive, the necessary environment, whatever its nature, must be complex and dependent on a multiplicity of coincident conditions, such as are not reasonably attributable to blind forces or pure mechanism. More reasonable to suppose that God deliberately set it up that way, according to Taylor. Now, this is by no means a proof, and very, very few. You have to be quite silly, really, to suppose that finding the character of the universe constituted a proof of the existence of God, and I'm not really aware of anyone who thinks that it does. But many theists with a capital T believe that their theism is quite strongly supported by this observation that the universe is apparently fine-tuned, has this fine-tuned character. So the Reverend John Polkinghorne takes the fine-tuned character of the universe to be strongly suggestive, is his phrase, so far as God with a capital G is concerned. And Alistair McGrath, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, he says that the fundamental themes of the Christian faith offers the best explanation of what is seen. And he is alluding there to, among other things, the fine-tuned character of the universe. And this is the bit that I disagree with. It seems to me that this is not the case, that the fine-tuned character of the universe strongly supports theism with a capital T. So, continue. To begin with, I want to run through 5 concerns about this claim of empirical support. And I'm mentioning the first 3 really just to kind of put them to one side. I'm not going to make anything rest on them at all. It's the last 2 that I'm really interested in. So here's the first one. The science is a little bit controversial. There are scientists, not that many actually, but there are certainly some scientists who deny that the universe even has this fine-tuned character. So, for example, Victor Stenger, Anthony McGuire, and Craig Hogan have studied those universes that result when 6 cosmological parameters are simultaneously varied by several orders of magnitude, and they claim that stars, planets, and life can plausibly emerge within many of them. Is that true? I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm not qualified to comment on that. I'm just pointing out that these such doubts have been raised. And then, of course, there's also the multiverse hypothesis. Quite a few scientists are drawn to the idea that this is one amongst many universes that vary in many ways. They have various different, set up in various different ways, different cosmological constants. And if you have a great many universes, inevitably, you know, it's highly likely that you're going to end up with one or two that are just right for life. They're going to have the Goldilocks property. So there's nothing particularly surprising about the fact that such a universe then exists. So if the multiverse hypothesis is true, well then there's nothing particularly mysterious about the fine-tuned character of the universe at all. You don't need a God to explain it. And it's sometimes said that, yes, you're just introducing a multiverse so you don't have to admit there's a God. But even that's not true. There are, it seems, some independent reasons for liking the multiverse theory, quite independently of whether or not you're a theist. At least that's what some of them say. Again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not going to really comment on that. I'm merely pointing out that there is this view. That's the first concern. The second concern is that the very idea that the universe is improbable looks a little bit odd. Trying to apply the notion of improbability or probability to the universe itself looks to some philosophers, and indeed even to some theists. This worry is by no means restricted to atheists. There are theists who raise this concern. That it's difficult to see how we can even apply these concepts in this particular case. So, for example, Professor Hugh Mellor at the University of Cambridge, emeritus now, he says that we have these two notions of probability. There's epistemic probability, how likely it is that something is true, given the evidence. So, how likely is it that it's raining outside, given that people are coming in with wet umbrellas or something? What is that noise? I'll just ignore it.
Turn it down.
Yeah.
No, move that up and move that one down.
Okay. Yeah. Is that better? Good. Where was it? Umbrellas. Wet umbrellas. See, that would be evidence that it's raining outside. Fairly high probability that it's raining outside, given the evidence. Or on the other hand, fairly low probability that the sun is shining outside, given that people are coming in with their umbrellas. So there's that kind of probability, and then there's another kind of probability which you might call chance or physical probability. What is the chance? What are the chances that the ball will land in a particular slot on a roulette wheel, given that you throw the ball in with a particular, within a particular range of velocities, within a particular range of angles, and so on? What is the chance that it's going to end up in number 27? And that probability may be perhaps quite high or perhaps quite low. So that's another kind of probability. They are not the same kind of probability, obviously. It's highly improbable, perhaps, that my parents met. What are the chances that they should meet each other, that their eyes should lock across a crowded room? If my dad had chosen to go to the loo at that moment, I would not be here. What are the chances, right? Very low. And yet, in another way, the chances are very high, epistemically. The probability that I exist is, for me, extremely high. Even for you, pretty damn high. You can be pretty sure that I do in fact exist. So the epistemic probability is high. The physical probability, the chance of it being the case, may be very low. So different kinds of probability. So now let's consider the probability that the universe exists. It's supposed to be improbable. Well, obviously we're not talking about epistemic probability then, are we? Because, here it is. It's the epistemic probability is very high indeed. So when people say the probability is low, they don't mean the epistemic probability, they mean the chances of its existing, if you like, you might call the physical probability. Only the universe can't have one of those, because physical probabilities require a background set of laws of nature. For example, when we talk about the ball landing in a particular slot on a roulette wheel, that presupposes certain laws of nature are operating, and the probability that the ball will land in that slot, given those laws, will then be such and such. But if you change the laws of nature, the probability changes. If you entirely remove any laws of nature and ask what is the probability that it will land in that slot, there is no probability. Right? You need a physical framework. You need laws of nature as the background, the conceptual background within which talk about physical probabilities or chance even makes sense. But as the universe is itself, a necessary condition of our then talking about such a background, the universe itself can be neither probable nor improbable. It simply is. And that's all we can say about it. Is this a good objection? I have no idea. I'm not sure about it myself. I'm just flagging it up as another objection that's been raised to this style of argument. And it's not the only objection. There are other objections. For example, Tim McGrew has raised, who's a Christian, he's raised this very similar, but not exactly the same kind of objection. Concern 3. You can have evidence for a hypothesis if the hypothesis makes sense, but what if it doesn't? What if there's some kind of conceptual problem with it? If I tell you that I've been on my travels and I've found a four-sided square, you're not going to be too impressed. You're certainly not going to mount an expedition to go out and see if it really is out there. You know just by thinking about it that it can't possibly exist. There's some kind of conceptual or logical incoherence in the very notion of such a thing. If the idea of a four-sided triangle involves such an incoherence, then perhaps other things do too. What about a non-spatial mountain? There's a mountain and it doesn't exist in space. Does that make sense? Well, when you begin to think about it, you realise that no, it doesn't really make sense, because the idea of a mountain is that the idea of one bit of it is higher than another bit. So how could there be a mountain that existed but not in space? You think it through, you begin to realise the very idea makes no sense. In which case, you certainly can't have evidence for it. But then maybe the idea of a non-temporal agent or intelligent being also is nonsensical. In order for there to be an intelligent being, agent who created the universe, presumably he has to perform actions, such as creating the universe. But actions require a temporal setting. He also has to be intelligent. He has to have beliefs and desires. Beliefs and desires, as we understand them, are states. And states have a temporal duration. How then can there be an agent who performs actions on the basis of his beliefs and desires within a non-temporal setting? It's not entirely clear that we can even make sense of that thought. So if God is supposed to be such a being, perhaps the very notion doesn't even make sense, in which case you can't have evidence, again, you can't have evidence that there is such a being. It involves a conceptual confusion. Is this a good objection? Is this a good worry? I don't know. I'm just flagging it up for your attention before we move on to concerns that I think I'm more interested in here. So, 3 concerns I've mentioned so far are: the science is not uncontroversial. It's not clear it even makes sense to say that the universe is improbable. It's not clear the God hypothesis in this case even makes sense. But let's suppose that there's no significant problem here at all. All of these problems can be dealt with. Now let's move on to the final 3 problems. So this is Paul Davies. The other main problem is that the identity of the designer need bear no relation at all to the God of traditional monotheism. The designing agency can be a committee of gods, for example. The designer can be a natural being or beings, such as an evolved supermind or super civilization existing in a previous universe or in another section of our universe, which made our universe using super technology. The designer can also be some sort of super-duper computer simulating this universe. This is a matrix-type universe, a virtual reality. It is indeed intelligently designed, but not by God, but by the aliens. So invoking a super-intellect is fraught with problems, concludes Paul Davies. Certainly the concern he's raising here is, why has it got to be a god? And even if it's got to be a god, why has it got to be that god? Right? These questions are not addressed by simply pointing to the fine-tuned character of the universe. Even if that were evidence for some kind of intelligence behind the universe, it is a huge and, as it stands, unwarranted further leap to draw the conclusion that God with a capital G here. So that's, I think that is quite a significant worry. If you claim that fine-tuning strongly supports theism with a capital T, well, does it? Actually, that's not at all clear to me that it does support theism with a capital T. And worse still, for theism with a capital T, there appears to be overwhelming empirical evidence against theism with a capital T. So when we take a step back and look at all of the evidence, not just picking and choosing which bits we're going to focus our attention on, but all of the empirical evidence, then it becomes very clear, perhaps, this is what we'll argue about, that there ain't no God with a capital G. We can rule this one out, this particular God hypothesis out, pretty conclusively on the basis of empirical observation. So, what kind of evidence? Well, you know, look at the universe. There's a lot of good stuff in it, but there's a lot of bad stuff too. You've heard all this before, but indulge me, right? Because I'm going to give a little twist in a minute. There's human suffering on an extraordinary scale. Let me pick one example. Kids, children, up until very recently, a third to a half of every generation died before they reached the age of 5. Usually in a pretty unpleasant way, malnutrition or disease or both. A third to a half of every generation of human children over 200,000 years before even the idea of God or Jesus or whatever shows up. What's all that about? Why would an all-powerful, all-good God unleash such horror on human beings? I mean, not just horror for the kids, but also for the parents. Why would he do that? Why would he create a universe that contains quite so much pain and suffering? And of course, it's not just human suffering. There are hundreds of millions of years of horror, of pain and suffering unleashed on the sentient inhabitants of this planet before we even show up. Creatures created in such a way that they must tear each other limb from limb in order to survive. I don't know, I watched the programme Life, David Attenborough, recently. The episode was about Komodo dragons. I don't know if you saw that episode. But the Komodo dragon that they were filming took a nip out of a buffalo, water buffalo. The water buffalo kind of shrugged it off and walked off. And you think, well, that wasn't very dramatic. But what's happened is that the Komodo dragon has poisoned the water buffalo and it's going to die, the water buffalo, but it's going to take a week or two. It's going to be very slow. And the Komodo dragon just starts following the water buffalo around. And the water buffalo becomes weaker, and the Komodo dragons start to congregate, they start nipping at it some more. The water buffalo is becoming more and more distressed, and eventually they eat it alive. And at the end of this particular program, the cameraman, they interviewed the team that makes the program. They interviewed the cameraman at the end of this, and he said it was his first wildlife assignment, and it was probably going to have to be his last. Because he simply couldn't cope with the horror of it all. And this was one animal, one episode on one small island. This is going on globally, and it has been going on for literally hundreds of millions of years before we even show up. This is fantastically good evidence. But if there is a God, if there is some designing intelligence, it's not all powerful and supremely benevolent, surely. So, that's the concern. Now, there are explanations which can be offered in order to account for much of the pain and suffering. So, some of it at least. So when here are some examples, you might say, well, look, you're forgetting, Stephen, about free will. Human beings have free will. God could have made us puppet beings that always did the good thing. But if you're a puppet being, you're not a moral agent, and your good actions will not be morally good. And moral goodness is the most important kind of goodness, so God will inevitably cut our strings and set us free. The downside to that is that sometimes some of us do bad things to each other. That is the price that God has to pay for moral goodness. So it's understandable that there will be inevitably some murders and wars and so on. It's the price paid for greater goods. Or if you don't like that explanation, you see, obviously there are limitations. I mean, the water buffalo, how does free will explain that? Hundreds of millions of years of suffering before free agency even show up. How is that, any of that explained? It isn't at all. Or you could say, well, character building is a veil of soul development, soul making, to use the phrase of John Hick. No pain, no gain. A parent will set the kid off on its bike and watch it fall off and scratch its knee and cry, and there'll be pain and there'll be suffering. But there's a reason for that. The parent will let it happen again and again, because eventually the kid learns to ride the bike, and the sense of achievement and so on more than compensates for the pain and suffering that the kid has been through. So this is a great character building exercise. It gives us the pain and the suffering, gives us opportunities to grow and develop more and spiritually help each other and so on. You might wonder about that. You might say, well, really? I mean, look at how people who have suffered, sometimes they say, yeah, that was great, but very often they bow out in misery and despair. And their characters are not built, their characters are destroyed, more often than not, actually. So the very idea that this is some great character building exercise, we might pull the other way, you might think, really. But perhaps that, again, that explains some of the pain and suffering. Again, it doesn't really help with the water buffalo. I mean, is that what's called building the character of the water buffalo? If you don't like that explanation, you can appeal to laws of nature. You can say, we need a regular universe in order to be able to help each other. For example, if I want to, you're tired and you're hungry, I want to cook you a meal, I need to know that if I light the match, the flame will be produced, there will be heat, I can do the cooking, warm you up. If there are no laws of nature, then these goods cannot exist, but there are downsides to the laws of nature. The same laws produce shifts in tectonic plates, and that produces earthquakes and so on, so there is inevitably going to be a downside. But it's still a better world than it would have been if it didn't have these kind of laws of nature. And if you don't like that explanation, or you think that's inadequate, you can add yet another move. You can say, who are you to think that you know the mind of God? This is the best of all possible worlds. It's just that you, being a mere human being, are not in a position to appreciate that there are very good reasons for all of these bad things. Inevitably, we can't understand it, because this is God we're dealing with, and we are mere human beings. Now, those are some of the explanations which theists, not by no means all of them, but some theists, with a capital T, offer in response to what looks like powerful empirical evidence against the God with a capital G hypothesis. They try and deal with the evidence in that way. They adopt that kind of explanatory strategy. So now I want to consider another hypothesis. Right. Suppose that there is an intelligence behind the universe. This universe was fine-tuned. It was fine-tuned by an all-powerful being that is supremely evil. It's all evil. Okay? There's a single intelligence behind the universe, all-powerful and all evil. How reasonable a belief is that? Seems to me highly unreasonable, very low on the scale of reasonableness. Why? Well, one of the most obvious reasons for thinking that this is an absurd thing to believe is that there's too much good in the universe. There's too much love and laughter and ice cream and rainbows. I mean, yeah, there's all bad stuff, but there's just way too much good for this possibly to be the creation of an evil deity. He might allow some goods as the price paid for greater evils, but he's not going to allow this much good. Why would he give us a lovely view, a beautiful sunset to enjoy? Why would he allow some people, like Mother Teresa said, to go around reducing suffering? He likes suffering. He's not going to allow people to help each other and reduce suffering. He will clamp down on that kind of behaviour straight away. Why would he give us children that we love and who love us unconditionally in return? And even God hates love, it makes him vomit. It's not the kind of thing that he's going to introduce into his creation. Why would he give some people like David Beckham endless health, wealth and happiness? Surely he would forge David Beckham for all eternity with a red hot cocoa and give him a new baby. Okay? So you might think that there's ample empirical evidence that there is no all-powerful, all-evil God, and that we can establish on the basis of empirical observation pretty conclusively that there is no such being. I mean, maybe there are other reasons for rejecting this God hypothesis too, but even on the basis of empirical observation, we can cross it off the list of possible fine-tuners, can't we? I think so. Right? But now consider this. There is an evil God. He is all-powerful. But he wants the universe to contain not just pain and suffering, but moral evil. Because, ask any religious person, moral evil is the worst kind of evil. People doing terrible things of their own free will. Now that's what an evil God is going to want the universe to contain, which means he's going to have to give us free will. He could have made us puppet beings that always did the bad thing, but then the world will not contain moral evil. So he cuts the strings, and sets us free. He also gives us weak and selfish natures, so we tend to succumb to temptation and do the bad thing and think we can get away with it. But the downside from the point of view of an evil God is that Mother Teresa then goes and helps people in the slums of Calcutta of their own free will. That is not what an evil God wants, but he allows it because it's the price he pays for the very great evil of moral evil existing on a stupendous scale across the face of this world. So what I've just done is I've taken a standard theist explanation and I've just run the same explanation in defense of the evil God hypothesis. And it is clearly absurd. Isn't it? Now let's move on to, this is a veil, a lot of character building, this is a veil of soul making, it's a veil of soul destruction. Why does God put some beauty into the world? To make our appreciation of the dreariness and ugliness of day-to-day life a little more acute. That's why an evil God would do it. As a contrast, why would he give us few children to love? Because only if you really, really love your kid, you will really, really suffer when he kills it in front of you, as he continuously does do, generation after generation, after over 200,000 years. Love is a prerequisite of suffering of that kind existing in the universe. And so an evil God will allow for love. Why would he allow David Beckham the new Bentley? He'll give some people fantastic health, wealth and happiness to make the rest of us feel bad. Who can rest content when they have so much? When we know they don't deserve it, and we know that no matter how hard we work, we will never achieve it. It's a fantastic recipe from the point of view of an evil God. But it maximises pain and suffering. All sorts of interesting forms of pain and suffering are not available to an evil God unless, like jealousy. Second order evil that requires the first order good, some people having fabulous stuff. So some people are going to get the fabulous stuff, but not too many. So that's why David Beckham gets the new Bentley. Because I mentioned the kids, the Bentley, the Mother Teresa. What have I missed out? I think I've covered most of the good stuff. Anyway, you can construct these explanations. You can also use a laws of nature type theodicy, as a sort of favoured by John Polkinghorne. You can say an evil God will certainly create a regular universe. Why? Because unless he does so, we can't do morally evil things to each other. In order for me to burn down your house with you and your kids inside it, I need to know that when I strike this match and put the petrol through the letterbox, there is going to be an explosion. Now, the downside to that is that there will be some beautiful sunsets because of the operation of the same laws of nature. This is just the downside to very much the upside as far as evil God is concerned, of our ability to do morally disgusting things to each other. We can only do that if there's some regularity to the universe. It needs to be a reasonably intelligible, war-governed universe in order for us to be able to do the horrendous things that evil God wants us to do to each other. And if you don't like any of that, well, remember, who are you to think that you know the mind of God? This really is the worst of all possible worlds. And of course, you will not be in a position to appreciate evil God's reasons for the good stuff that he allows. There are such reasons, you must just trust me that they exist. And necessarily there are going to be things that we can't understand. So I just run all of those explanations that I ran to defend a belief in a good God. I've run the same explanations to defend belief in an evil God. And Do they work when it comes to belief and defending the belief in an evil God? It seems to me pretty obvious that they don't. But this is just complicated, convoluted gerrymandering, explaining away what is actually, or should be, as clear as the nose and our faces. There ain't no evil God. And we all know it on the basis of empirical observation, notwithstanding these endless explanations that might be cooked up for all the good stuff. That can be done to defend belief in an evil God against empirical refutation, but it's frankly, it's comical. In some cases, it is literally a joke, the suggestion that we can explain this stuff away in this kind of way. So the question is, well, why should we consider that the mirror explanations in defence of a good God are any more successful? I mean, why are they to be taken more seriously? Why aren't they actually pretty comical? And the fact is that to many of us, they do look pretty comical. I mean, that's the irony. I mean, I find it utterly baffling why people think these explanations of evil are remotely adequate. It seems just obvious to me that the universe contains far too much pain and suffering for it to be plausibly the case that there's a very powerful good God behind things. It seems to me that the evil God hypothesis is pretty conclusively ruled out on the basis of empirical observation, notwithstanding the fine-tuned character of the universe. True, an evil God would explain the fine-tuned character of the universe. And if you only focus on the fine-tuned character of the universe and just excluded everything else, perhaps you could make a case for saying, well, there's some support there for my particular deity. But if you take a step back and look at all of the empirical evidence in total, then that's just it would be a ludicrous argument to say, oh, look at the fine-tuned character of the universe, that supports my belief in the evil God. It clearly does not when you take a step back and look at the overall pattern of the evidence. But then the question is, well, why then does the fine-tuned character of the universe support theism with a capital T, given the sheer quantity of pain and suffering that the universe clearly contains, notwithstanding all of these convoluted attempts to explain the way that have been cooked up over the last couple of thousand years. So that's really my main concern. And I'll just add a few more. How are we doing? We're okay. Just add a couple more thoughts. So an evil God is pretty conclusively ruled out empirically, despite the fact that he would explain the fine-tuned character of the universe as well as the good God. So why isn't the good God pretty conclusively ruled out on the basis of empirical evidence? We may not know why the universe exists or why it is fine-tuned. Perhaps we'll never know. Perhaps there is some intelligence behind everything. Perhaps there is. It doesn't follow that we can't rule out certain hypotheses pretty conclusively on the basis of observation. We can rule out the evil God hypothesis on the basis of empirical observation. And if we can rule out the evil God hypothesis on the basis of empirical observation, why can't we not do the same for the good God hypothesis? And in fact, that's just what I do for this and other reasons too. It seems to me maybe there's some God back there somewhere, a deist God. But an evil one, no. Obviously not. A good one, no. Obviously not. Or so it seems to me. Now maybe I'm missing something. I mean, there's all sorts of things that might be said. I mean, clearly this is very sketchy, right? All sorts of things might be said in response to it. I'm just trying to set up the challenge to begin with. Here's the final moral I wanted to add. Any theory, no matter how ludicrous, can be made to fit the evidence, can be made consistent with it. If you've ever talked to somebody that's perhaps suffering from some mental condition, right, you may believe that dogs are spies from the planet Venus, right? If they're intelligent, they will, and they've had some time to think it through, they will probably have an answer for any of the most obvious objections that you might raise to their theory. Dogs are spies from the planet Venus, you say. Well, why they can't even talk? Yes, they can. They just choose to keep their linguistic abilities hidden from us. But how do they communicate to Venus? They don't have any radios. Their radios are secreted inside their brains. That's why they never show up in Faraday's basket. We've cut the dog's head open, there ain't no radio in there. The radio is made out of material indistinguishable from brain stuff. We can't detect any radio waves coming out of the dog's head. Well, it's broadcasting on a frequency that is undetectable by us and our current technology. But we've looked at Venus, it's covered in boiling sulfuric acid. They live in deep underground bunkers. Trust me, the invasion is imminent. You know? That kind of conversation can continue forever. Any theory, no matter how ludicrous, can be endlessly protected, endlessly, well, ultimately immunised against falsification by those kinds of strategy. And something like those kinds of strategy were what I was doing to defend my belief in an evil God. You can just endlessly put up explanations for the good stuff. But still, it's pretty obvious that dogs are not spies from the planet Venus, and it's pretty obvious that there ain't no evil God. If you engage then in that kind of explaining away, you render your theory immune to scientific refutation. The theory is not confirmed, but if you get really good at it, and if it becomes kind of part of your character to habitually think in this kind of way, something like a revelation can happen. Here's Karl Popper. Those of my friends who are admirers of Marx and Freud and Adler, so Marx's theory of history and Freud and Adler's theory of the unconscious, psychoanalytic theories. We're impressed by a number of points common to these theories, and especially by their apparent explanatory power. These theories appear to be able to explain practically everything that happened within the fields to which they referred. The study of any of them seemed to have the effect of an intellectual conversion or revelation, opening your eyes to a new truth hidden from those not yet initiated, Popper says. He had this experience talking to the people committed to these kind of theories, that they felt that they could see something that other people were just missing. And what was partly going on here was that they were developing and defending theories in such a way that those theories would always fit the evidence. Always. It was guaranteed. There was never going to be allowed to be a counterexample, ever. Something was always cooked up to explain away the apparent anomaly. Popper continues, once your eyes were thus opened, you saw confirmed instances everywhere, and the world was full of verifications of the theory. Whatever happened always confirmed it. Thus its truth appeared manifest, and unbelievers were clearly people who did not want to see the manifest truth, who refused to see it, either because it was against their class interest, which is what you would say if you were a Marxist. You can't see it because it's against your class interest, or because of the repressions which were still unanalyzed and crying out for treatment if you were a Freudian or Hegelian or whatever it happened to be. So now consider Ken Ham, who's a young earth creationist who believes the entire universe is 6,000 years old. He's got a he's got a museum of creation science in America where you can see Adam and Eve frolicking with the velociraptors in the Garden of Eden. The entire universe, just 6,000 years old. It was all great to begin with until Adam and Eve chose to go against God. And the fossil record is a product of the flood, the biblical flood for the most part. All of those sedimentary layers are actually layers of mud which were laid down during the flood. Talk to a young earth creationist, you'll find any evidence that you can think of against young earth creationists, and they've already got it covered. Right? They've got multi-million-dollar research institutes churning out explanations for anything that you could possibly come up with that might look like evidence against young earth creationism. They'll explain it all away and then some. Or they'll say, well, God's mysterious ways. They're very, very good at doing that. And once you're really in the habit of doing that, you end up saying things like this. Increasing numbers of scientists are realising that when you take the Bible as your basis and build your models of science and history upon it, all the evidence from the living animals and plants and the fossils and the cultures fits. That's my italics. This confirms that the Bible really is the Word of God and can be trusted totally. In fact, it seems weird to Ken that other people can't see it. He says, why can't the humanists and the evolutionists see that all of the evidence supports exactly what the Bible says? It is because they do not want to see it, right? A bit like the Marxists and the Adlerians and Freudians. It is not because the evidence is not there. They refuse to allow the evidence to be correctly interpreted in light of the biblical teaching. It's a matter of interpretation. Come into the evidence and you can look at it this way, look at it that way. And, you know, it's not, you know, there's plenty of scope here for both positions, which is why both should be taught in classrooms, of course. Young earth creationism, alongside the theory of evolution, matter of interpretation. Christian theology provides an interpretative framework by which nature may be seen in a specific way that allows it to disclose God, says Alistair McGrath. Presented with counter-evidence against theism with a capital T, and in this case he's responding to Richard Dawkins' admittedly pretty dodgy argument. But he presumably would say much the same thing about the evidential problem of evil, which I ran earlier. McGrath says, any given set of observations can be explained by a number of theories. To use the jargon of the philosophy of science, theories are underdetermined by the evidence. The question then arises, what criterion can be used to decide between them, especially when they are, quote, empirically equivalent, unquote. That's to say, both fit the data equally well. It's a matter of interpretation. He says, the debate rages unresolved and its outcome is entirely to be expected. The great questions remain unanswered. We cannot answer them, or we must answer them on grounds other than the sciences. So, Alistair McGrath says that kind of thing, when his belief system is under threat, empirical evidence seems to be threatened. And I can't see that this really differs very much from what Ken Ham says, in essence. But maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm missing something. It seems to be just wrong to me, because you can certainly rule out an evil God on the basis of empirical observation. And I suspect most of us know it. So you can answer the big questions, it turns out, by observation. It's not that that there is an evil God or that there isn't, that these are both equally supported by the data. No, it's just obviously no evil God, and we all know it on the basis of the empirical evidence. It's not a matter of interpretation at all. True, you can endlessly crook up explanations for the counter-evidence, but that is not to say that they are empirically equivalent. Of course they are not empirically equivalent. One is clearly false, and the other one is clearly true. Evil God, false. No evil God, true. Right? And you can know that on the basis of observation. So what Alice is saying here is not even true. It seems to be just an immunising strategy. But then he says that when he looks at the fine-tuned character of the universe, he says, oh, the best explanation of that would be Christianity. So it turns out, oh, well, actually, when you look at empirical evidence, it can support certain hypotheses, certain God hypotheses. But there's a certain amount of sleight of hand goes on with the word prove. He says you can't prove these things one way or the other. But still, he thinks by far the best explanation is theism with a capital T, as far as what we observe in the world around us. And first of all, I just can't see that is true. It seems to me that there's dodging and weaving going on here. When evidence crops up that seriously threatens, empirical evidence, seriously threatens what Alistair McGrath believes, then an immunising strategy is employed, which looks more or less exactly the same to me as the one that Ken Ham employs. But when it suits him, suddenly something looks like it might support theism, well then that's allowed to provide the support. Now the evidence can do its job. And this just seems to me to be picking and choosing, and much like what Ken Ham does. So I'm not sure I don't know why I stuck this slide on at the end. This is just an example of John Polkinghorne explaining away the earthquakes and the tsunamis and the kids being buried alive and so on as the outcome of the operation of the laws of motion. He says earthquakes occur, and if they are under the sea, they generate tsunamis because there are tectonic plates that sometimes slip. Would it not have been better, therefore, for God to arrange the Earth to have a solid crustal over? The answer is no, it wouldn't. The gaps between the plates enable mineral resources to well up from deeper down to replenish the face of the Earth. Without this happening, life would not be able to keep going very long. This is I'm just providing this as an explanation of how you can, an example of how you can explain away the past by appealing in this case to kind of laws of nature type policy. Exactly the same theories that can be used to defend belief in the world. So there you go. That's why I'm sceptical of the suggestion that what we're looking at when we look at fine-tuning character of the universe, that provides any kind of significant support for theism. And it may well be that many of the people in this room, perhaps all of you, we get boring if this is true, perhaps all of you would agree with that. That might well turn out to be the case. But it does appear to me to be the case. I can't see that fine-tuning as it stands offers any significant support to theism with a capital T at all, any more than it does to the evil God hypothesis, which remains utterly absurd. So there we go. I'll stop there. That was an hour exactly.
Thank you, Stephen. So, lots of things to ask questions about and comment on. Let's start with here.
So you've ruled out the three O God, the omnipotent, omniscient, and what was the third O?
Omnibenevolent.
Omnipotent, yeah, that's
Yeah.
usually just
Yeah.
close to the
Yeah.
But have you ruled out a God that only fits two of those?
No.
Right, so you could have a benevolent and omniscient, but not omnipotent God.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about the evidential problem of evil is that it's only a... I mean, it's not even a problem if you don't believe in God, of course. And it's not even a problem. It's not a problem if you drop any one of the three O's. Yeah. So those kind of gods we can still discuss. I mean, I don't believe in any of them either, but I certainly don't believe in the all-powerful, all-knowing evil one. And for much the same kinds of reasons, I don't believe in all-powerful, all-good one either. So I've only been dealing with those. The other gods, maybe they're a bit more reasonable. I still don't find them terribly reasonable suggestions, but at least they're not as ridiculously evil as is the evil god one.
So what would you do with sort of a Hegelian God, which is conceived by him as a metaphor for human freedom, for example?
I don't know enough about Hegel to... I mean, a metaphor... I mean, it's a metaphor for human freedom.
Well, yeah, in the sense that Hegel doesn't want to argue that God is he doesn't want to emphasize
Yes.
God.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to locate God physically in the universe somehow. So he talks about the spirit with a capital S, but there's a sort of cooperation between his notion of spirit and humanity, and God becomes more actualized in the world, so we become more aware of freedom.
Well, you know, you're telling me, is he a theoretical or isn't he? If he is, well, he's in trouble with empirical evidence, and if he isn't, I have no argument against that, and I don't intend to run such an argument. It just boils down to that. But because I'm not an expert on Hegel, I'm not qualified to say which of those two claims are being put forward here. So yes, by all means, I mean this is true. By all means, say, but that's not the God that I believe in, as so many people will do at this particular point. They'll say, oh, but I do. How naive and silly of you, Stephen, to suppose that anyone would ever believe in a God like that. Well, actually, loads of people do believe in a God like that. Lots of people do. But if you don't believe in a God like that, and you believe in something else, well then we can talk about that. But that would be a whole other conversation. I've just focused in, as I said right at the beginning, I did say, just focusing on this particular God. But beware that those who engage in a kind of sleight of hand, dance of the seven veils. My God is good. Oh no, not in that way. But in another way, he is. What way? Well, it's hard for me to say. It's a sort of an analogy, but I can't really tell you exactly in what sense the analogy works or spell it out in any detail. So you just end up with this moving target that kind of constantly moves around, and you don't know whether you're dealing with a 3A God and this particular problem, or whether maybe the problem doesn't apply. People will play that game sometimes, which I find very frustrating. So, for example, it seems to me that, to pick a name, this doesn't get me in trouble, I think Karen Armstrong does that a lot in her books. When you run any kind of argument in the existence of God, gosh, you naive and unsophisticated twit. That's not what religious people are talking about. But then flip to another page in the book, and it turns out that God is a label for, and it turns out to be all these good characteristics. Well, you know, this is just sleight of hand, surely. So as long as you're not doing that,
some people claim to know God and know that he exists through personal experience. How do you respond?
yeah, now that's a very important point, isn't it? Because you might say that there is the evidence, and then there's what I know in my heart to be true. And I haven't even talked about that today. I've just been focusing on the empirical evidence and the suggestion that the empirical evidence provides support for theism with a capital T, but doesn't really significantly undermine theism with a capital T. It seems to me that position is not tenable. But if you were to say, well, I know in my heart that God is real, this is some other epistemic route to God, perhaps, well then there are other things that I will... Again, I'm not convinced, but I have to say other things. I mean, I can say something if you like. I mean, what I might say is... So you might say something like this. You might say, look, sometimes... well, look, there are so many different kinds of religious experience which contradict each other to a very large extent. And, you know, this God, that God, all different kinds of God experiences. And we know then that much of the experience, in many cases, must be deceptive, must be unreliable. And once you know that you're dealing with, once you know the experiences which have that character, which are nevertheless extremely convincing to the person who is having it, once you have that information that many of these experiences must be unreliable, then that should give you pause to think about just taking your own experience at face value. Surely. It seems to me. So that would be my first suggestion. But hardly. It's just that's such a vast and interesting topic, but that would be my first kind of port of call to these arguments.
You said just there that you mentioned knowing in your heart.
Yes.
I wonder whether what you were talking about with the evil God and the clear disproof of being an evil God, isn't that just based on the fact that you're a good guy and you know in your heart that an evil God wouldn't behave like that and therefore it's ludicrous? So do you see what I mean? Or you took
you mean that I'm relying on an innate sense of good and evil, right and wrong?
Yes.
Maybe?
Yes.
Yes.
Because you know that in your heart, that there is good and that there is evil, and therefore the evil God scenario is clearly ridiculous.
Yes.
Because it's based on the way you feel about it.
Yes. I've never had quite that move you made before. It's close to. So I'm in running the evidential problem of good or the evidential problem of evil, I'm presupposing that I know what good and evil are. Right? You could frame it like that. And then possibly you might add the further thought that actually there couldn't be good and evil without a God. Without a God. Some would add that further thought. Certainly you need God, perhaps because you need God in order for good and evil to exist, or perhaps in order to allow you to have knowledge of good and evil. Actually, even an evil God would want to have knowledge of good and evil, because if you don't know good from evil, you can't do more evil. So even a God is going to supply you with a fairly reliable sense of right and wrong, an evil God. So the mere fact that you have such a sense is no evidence that there's no such being is precisely what we expect it to give you. But I don't think that was your point, was it? I think
it was more that when you run through the disproofs of the evil God, the reason that we see them as disproved is because we know it's so ridiculous that there should be an evil God wanting to behave like that.
Well, I'm not sure that's what you said. I thought what you were saying was that we're relying on an innate sense of right and wrong, and that was somehow a problem for me. I mean, you sometimes hear this thing. You hear people say, look, you as an atheist can't run the problem of evil, because according to atheism, there is no good and evil. Atheists can't even allow for context of good and evil. It's a very common apologetic move. It's not a very credible move, but I'm not sure whether that's, I don't think that's the move you're making. But that clearly won't do, because as an atheist, I can be a moral nihilist. I can say, actually, I don't believe in good and evil. I mean, as a matter of fact, I do, but I don't have to in order to run the argument. The argument is that if there were a God who is good, meaning by that what Christians appear to be by it, whether or not I buy into the concept myself, if there were a good God in that sense, he would not do these kinds of things. He would not, for example, allow for gratuitous suffering on a cosmic scale. In fact, he won't allow for any gratuitous, that's to say, pointless suffering for which there is no good reason. And so there's just an awful lot of that kind of thing. And it does then appear to constitute excellent evidence against the existence of a God like that. But in order to run that argument, I don't even have to believe in religion myself. I don't even have to suppose I could think these were vacuous concepts. The fact is that the Christian is committed to those concepts, and then you can just use that concept against the Christian. You can say that their own position is internally incoherent. But if they perhaps, I think I said enough. I'll stop there.
Well, you might just answer the issue that the Christian beliefs allow for gratuitous stuff. If you think of the problems of Job, he suffered.
Yeah, I think that if that really happened, that would be really good evidence that God is not all good.
But it's held to be coherent evidence for God in the Bible.
It is. It's mistakenly, because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, an evil God will get into a bet with Satan. I mean, really? I mean, I could never make any sense of that story whatsoever. It seems to be, on the face of it, a story, a morality tale designed to scare people into bloody unbelieving. Do not doubt, because this is what's going to happen to you. That's the moral of the story. That's the moral.
That's not the story at all. That's not the faction.
No, I'm thinking about Isaac and Abraham.
Yeah.
As the others.
Job was righteous and honourable and believing God.
Yeah, in the end, he gets some other kids to replace the one that's
in the end.
Yeah, so he gets so stick with him, and it'll all be right.
But there's gratuitous suffering on
You'll get some other wives, despite the fact that those ones died all of it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Right, if that's what counts as empirical evidence, we're in big trouble.
This is perhaps a question not only for you, but for everybody here. I'm puzzled, and perhaps it's because you are all Anglo-Saxon, that nobody spoke about Satan until you just mentioned. I come from a culture, I was raised in a Catholic culture, where we see God's powers balanced with Satan's powers, and they are both powerful, and sometimes God is distracted and then Satan comes and does the evil. And that could somehow explain your theory of the evil God. But I'm puzzled, why is it that you don't discuss the existence of Satan and you're all concerned about the discussion of the existence of God.
Maybe somebody else should answer that.
Well, I'll have a quick go. I find the whole idea, as a Christian, I find the whole idea of Satan absolutely absurd.
Me too.
And of course, it would go along with your basic argument as to why the God that you describe should create such a being in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
All-knowing, omniscient, knows what's going to happen to this good angel. So,
Well, maybe not, because maybe it was a result of
I'm afraid
Satan's free will. But certainly the fact that he allows Satan to go around doing that kind of thing. Remember, this is the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. So it can be the case that God can't prevent Satan doing the things he was doing. And it can't be the case that he doesn't know about it, he was distracted. I mean, God doesn't get distracted.
I think Satan is a rubbish argument. But
We agree on that.
I was disappointed.
There's an explanation.
I was disappointed that in a very lively and entertaining thing, you really concentrated on theodicy, and you concentrated on it in a rather, I'm not being unkind, in a superficial way, as though it was a kind of knockdown argument that was really obvious to everyone, that the sufferings of Waterbuckle in wherever it was just almost by itself sufficient justification to say there is far too much suffering in the world, therefore there can't be a God. As though you were not aware, as I'm sure you are aware, of the vast amount of philosophical discussion on the problem of evil and theodicy, which shows that intelligent thinking, good philosophers, differ deeply as to the quality and the conclusiveness of the argument about the existence of evil. That's the first thing. The second thing is that partly the reason why they disagree so deeply is because there are more reasons for believing in God derived from the universe than fine-tuning.
Yes.
And fine-tuning is a very recent thing. And
Maybe that's correct. Right, I brought this up. Yeah, so what are you going to say?
the antecedent for the problem of evil is the other, I would say, substantially good reasons for hypothesizing the kind of God that you have described. And just the third thing.
But what are you talking about in terms
Sorry,
of other empirical evidence?
It seems to me that, the basic arguments from the existence of the universe in the first place requiring an explanation. Secondly,
But an evil God explains that too.
the order and the consider. All I'm saying is that there are arguments other than the fine-tuning.
No, I agree, but I don't think that those are, because those all seem to be pretty neutral on God's moral properties. The fact that the universe exists, but why a good God rather than a morally neutral God or an evil God? Why? But there are. Now, this is interesting. There are. There are non-empirical arguments for the existence of a good God, which might perhaps be brought into the equation here to tip the balance in favour of a good God very significantly. And of course, we've set all of those to one side because we're only focusing on the empirical arguments. But even within the class of empirical arguments, you might say there are some which are specifically for a good God, which tip the scales in the direction of a good God and away from the evil God. So you might say, for example, the fact that people do, as a matter of empirical fact, they do have religious experiences on a big scale, they do, and they don't report experiencing an evil God. They experience a good God, generally. They may differ on the details, but it's a good experience. That is evidence for a good God, not an evil God, and it's empirical evidence. Right? Similarly, miracles, you find people being healed miraculously, and the Catholic Church may investigate and actually rubber stamp that as an official miracle. But you don't find the reverse happen. You don't find the bad with the reverse miracles. So miracles constitute evidence for a good God. Now, so Now, I agree these are interesting cases, but is this better evidence for a good God than an evil God? Actually, when you think it through. First of all, plenty of people do have experiences of something awful behind the universe. It's not an uncommon experience. So Schopenhauer, Peter will set you straight with me on this, but I mean, Schopenhauer felt that there was something just deeply disturbing behind the empirically observable realm. And he thought he caught a glimpse of it. And if you go to some mental institutions, you'll find that's not a completely uncommon experience. The thing is, when you have that kind of experience, you put on medication. When you have the other kind of experience, you put on a drug roll. But is there actually a significant difference between the two? Why actually consider one reliable and the other one not? Well, maybe one is genuinely an experience of something transcendental. But look, if I was an evil God, I wouldn't necessarily want people to know I was evil. This is what I would do. I would go to these people here and say, I'm put on the white robe and the halo, even though I'm evil, appear in an experience, right? And then tell them some stuff, and I'll do some miracles so they'll know it's me. Bona fide supernatural miracles. And I'll go to those people over there and I'll do exactly the same thing, and then I'll tell them something that contradicts what I told them, and then I'll just stand back. That's what I do. And of course we know what's going to happen next. So that's a recipe for endless pain and suffering and despair and moral horror, as well as each side goes against the other with the knowledge that they have the one true God on this side, and they'll go to heaven when they die, so it doesn't matter if they die in some awful battle slaughtering the unbelievers on the other side. If you were a good God, surely you would not produce these experiences and these miracles in that kind of way, because it so obviously is a recipe for disaster. When you look at how religious experiences and miracles are distributed, it seems to be in exactly the kind of way they would be distributed if there was an evil God, and not at all the way they would be distributed if there was a good God. And so it may be that the empirical evidence favours, this is shocking, isn't it, favours the evil God hypothesis. The empirical evidence might yet turn out to, it's still ridiculous, right? But it might be that there's just a little bit more support for the evil God hypothesis than the good God hypothesis, maybe.
Can you just say why it's ridiculous? Because that was Phil's question.
What? The
It's
evil God
ridiculous
hypothesis?
self-evident.
Well, when I run this kind of evil God challenge, I usually start off by asking people, what's your initial response to the suggestion that there's an evil God? Do you believe in God like this? And no one puts their hand up. And then if you ask people, well, why don't you believe in an evil God? I didn't do that this time, but if you do ask them, they will very often spontaneously say, well, you can't believe that. I mean, it's pretty obvious that this is. So their first intuition, right, is that it's pretty obvious that there's no evil God, and indeed it is empirically obvious that there is no evil God. Now, once they begin to recognise the implications of that for their theism with a capital T, you often find them beginning to backtrack quite rapidly. They start to say things like, oh well, hang on a minute, maybe belief in an evil God isn't so ridiculous after all, they start to say. Maybe that initial intuition was wrong. And so and at that point, obviously, I'll need to provide some additional argument, which I can do, as to why no, their initial intuition was absolutely correct. It was the right. Your first intuition, of course there's no evil God, based on empirical observation, is exactly the right one, actually. And the reason that people backtrack and start to want to abandon it is because they realise how much trouble they are going to be in, so far as theism with a capital T is concerned. But I can give you more arguments as to why no, the intuition is a perfectly good one if you want.
Right, well, let's have another question.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think we're in very similar kind of camps, but I do want to kind of unpack a little bit what you mean by empirical evidence. And just to use it, I mean, it's something that's stopping thinking on both sides of the facts, to be perfectly honest. I think that some of the accusations you've made against the theists with the capital T can also be leveled at the atheists with the capital A. I think a similar debate, possibly the abortion debate, where do we really need to recourse to empirical evidence when it comes to all the discussions about when life begins, whether or not a fetus is a moral entity? Well, who cares? Because one thing we do know is that the woman is alive, and that she's a moral entity, and that she has a right to, well, it's getting into the kind of dodgy ground kind of place, she has a right over her own reproductive choices. In a similar way, but we're getting sidetracked into a debate we don't need to, and I do compare, I mean, obviously people do have this kind of 3-0 debate, but if people keep just mustering about that and actually ignore the kind of more interesting discussions that actually probably around the deism and the theism of authority, we're actually just fueling that.
Fueling what?
Fueling the continued perception that there are only those two views.
Yeah, well, I do try and, whenever I talk about this stuff, I do always try and flag up that, of course, this is just one way of thinking about God, and there are many other ways. And I did all of that work, the clarificatory work at the beginning. It does matter that what people believe, I think, and if they believe in a God, the 3-0 God. I think if it were true that that is an absurd belief, and indeed ruled out empirically, I think that is very important. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions, such as, why do people think it's so not unreasonable if it really is very unreasonable indeed? I mean, what's going on there, actually? What are the psychological explanations? So, there's a whole research program there, right, which we could get into. But what I thought we would... So it's not a waste of time, for all sorts of reasons. But what I thought you were going to say to begin with, and then you didn't, was you had a bone to pick with empirical, because it's not really science, is it? The evidential problem of evil. I keep calling it empirical evidence, like, oh yeah, it's a scientific argument. And actually it's not supposed to be a scientific argument, and actually it may be an unfortunate phrase to use, empirical evidence, because what I really mean is observational evidence. Okay? The fact is that you can empirically or observationally refute all sorts of claims without applying the scientific method, which after all we've only had for about 400 years, and yet people were happily and effectively refuting claims empirically long before that. So if, for example, I say I've got a cat stuffed up my shirt, you can have a little pat and listen for some meows, and establish pretty conclusively, on the basis of observation, that there ain't no cat up there. I mean, it's always possible there is one under my left armpit after I'm breeding micro cats or something. But, it would be a reasonable conclusion to draw that there is no cat on the basis of the observations that you've made. Similarly, then we can reasonably draw the conclusion that there is no evil God on the basis of a survey of what the world is like. And then why not? It's not, I wouldn't call it science. I don't think it is science. I don't think we need science. But you can rule out the God hypothesis observationally. Okay. So it's a very loose way of using the word.
I think that's exactly what I was meaning. It's the same thing. You don't have to recourse to science.
Yes.
To put forward the strongest pro-choice argument you can. Like, science doesn't have to come into that conversation.
Yeah.
Science is not going to be able to say when life begins in a way that either camp will ever be happy with. What we do know is that the woman exists in our life.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take another question.
Yeah.
Hi Stephen, thanks for your talk. It seems to me that your argument rests on some sort of symmetry between good and evil. That's why you can run the hypothesis each way. And I'm trying to think of a way in which they might be asymmetrical.
That's the way to go.
Yeah, so I've got two ideas.
Yeah.
One is Augustine, well, not really my ideas. One is Augustine's idea that evil is a privation of good.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you could talk about whether you could run it so that good is a privation of evil. And the other would be some sort of Platonic form of the good, and whether it makes sense to have a Platonic form of the evil of which everything in the world is a better copy. That one seems to me a bit stronger and a bit more difficult to
I think you're right. I think the Platonic one is, I think the privation one ain't going anywhere, but the Platonic one maybe, So actually, if you're interested in this, okay, I wrote an academic paper called The Evil God Challenge, which is in Religious Studies 2010. Evil God Challenge, Religious Studies 2010. If you email me, I will send you a copy of the paper, and at the end of the paper, I do consider, for example, platonic forms a good kind of response. I mean, here's a quick reply. You might be able to show, I said earlier on, maybe we could rule out certain hypotheses conceptually, you know, four-sided squares,
Four-sided
triangles. Yeah, we can rule out four-sided squares. It's really apostrophe. Okay, I better go slow. Four-sided triangles, perhaps we can rule those out.
In three dimensions are okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to pursue that. What I thought I wanted to articulate was this. If you could show that there was some logical contradiction in the notion of an evil God, then you would have an a priori, non-empirical reason to reject it out of hand before we even get to consider what the empirical evidence might be. And that's the reason to reject it. So there is a very significant asymmetry between the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis, and you've identified what it is, perhaps. Well, I mean, first of all, we'd have to actually establish that that was true, and we'd also have to establish that there was no similar conceptual or logical problem with the idea of a good God either. And of course, plenty of people think there is such a problem. But even, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, right, we've established that asymmetry. Does that deal with the evil God challenge? No. Because if it is the case that you would nevertheless rule out an evil God on the basis of observation, notwithstanding whether or not there is any kind of logical problem, then you can still run a challenge. You can say, well, if you would rule out the evil God anyway, conclusively on the basis of empirical observation, notwithstanding the fact that there is some logical problem as well, then why don't you rule out the good God? So identifying that kind of asymmetry, it would be interesting. It would be an interesting exercise, and perhaps it can be done. But ultimately, it's irrelevant so far as the evil God challenge that I've articulated today is concerned. But you're right. I mean, that's where there are definitely, I think, some interesting asymmetries. I do not claim a perfect symmetry between these two God hypotheses. Actually, there are definitely some interesting asymmetries. There are some theorises that don't work in reverse. So the full type theorises don't fit in an obvious way, for example. I mentioned that stuff in the paper for
Okay, well that's a good moment to stop. Another good moment is that tea is available downstairs right now. And we'll start again at 4 o'clock exactly. Before we go down, let me remind you there's a box here for questions for the panel tonight. And we'd be really glad if you put the hardest questions you possibly think of in that box for the panel tonight to keep them awake over dinner. So, who's on the panel? John Durant is chairing it.
I'm on it, and Mark LaRouche, actually, is still on, and Keith.
Did you hear that?
Keith, John, and Mark. All speakers so far apart from Stephen.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Really like to stick around, but my children will feel big trouble for me. I'm not there with the car.
Well, they just set us problems.
Yeah.